Every leader knows that a thriving organization depends on the energy, productivity, and commitment of its people. But few leaders are able to cultivate the employee engagement and performance needed for this level of success. What's the difference? Positive leadership practices. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast with your host, positive work culture expert, Alex Bratty. Ready to harness the power of positive leadership? Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bratty, and in this episode, we're going to talk about personal leadership philosophy. Do you have one? What is it? Do you need to develop one? And how do you do that? But before we dive into all that, I just want to thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, rate, and review it so we can keep expanding this positive leadership movement. And remember, if you've got a burning question about positive leadership or you're grappling with an issue like this in your organization, just drop me a line at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com and I'll address it on the show. And I just want to take a moment to say that this episode is especially near and dear to my heart today because I'm dedicating it to a friend who has been an exceptional leader his whole life. And unfortunately, over the holiday season, he ended up in the hospital for several weeks. He's home now and he's recovering, thankfully. And so this episode goes out to all of you, but particularly to him while he is recuperating. All right, so let's talk about personal leadership philosophy. What is it? Well, essentially, it's your core beliefs about how you should lead, the type of leader you want to be. And the reason it's important to have this is so that you are firmly rooted and you know exactly what to do when you are tested, when times are tough, when you have difficult decisions to make. I mean, let's face it, as a leader, we often find ourselves in complicated and uncertain situations with decision-making dilemmas because guess what? We've got different stakeholders who have different needs and values. And so if you don't have a foundational leadership philosophy, it's easy to be swayed by one group or another, or perhaps even tempted to just take the path of least resistance. And of course, we all know that often that's not the right thing to do, and it's not the right thing for your team. But if you have a guiding philosophy, you can go back to it again and again and use it as a lens through which you make all your decisions. So that might sound a little nebulous, so let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here and what it means to have a personal leadership philosophy, particularly from the point of view of positive leadership. And then I'll share my own with you and how you can clarify and develop yours, okay? So the first example I want to take is from Howard Behar. So he is the former CEO of Starbucks, so he knows a thing or two. And what I'm going to share with you comes from his book, It's Not About the Coffee, Leadership Principles from a Life at Starbucks. Now, he has a few different principles in there, but two that I really want to highlight in this episode in terms of guiding philosophy for leadership. So the first story that he tells is, and his philosophy is about wearing one hat. And what he means by that is you've got to truly know who you are as a leader. So he tells this very interesting story about when he was first starting out in business. He was working for, I believe it was a furniture company. And he did really well there, and he got promoted several times. And the head of the board came to him and said, you know, we want to promote you and put you in this leadership role. But, you know, to do all that, you need to be this, that, and the other. And this chairman of the board was very different to Howard. I mean, he totally respected him. He absolutely thought of him as a good leader, but their styles were different. Their values were a little different. And so he listened to this chairman and thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to basically emulate who this chairman is if they're promoting me into this role. Like, that's who I need to become. And so that's what he set out to do. And so he started emulating the chairman of the board. Well, he became absolutely miserable. He was miserable going to work. He was miserable at work. He came home to his wife after a few months and said, you know what, I got to quit. I mean, this is miserable. And so his wife said, well, look, before you do that, go talk to your mentor, go talk to the rest of the executive team who had a say in this in terms of you being promoted, and, see if there's a solution here before you make that big decision to walk away from what had been, the pinnacle of his career at that time. He was at the highest level of success at that moment in his life. So he went to his mentor, who was one of the executive team, and he was a key member in terms of deciding this promotion in the first place. And he told him what he was feeling. And the guy said to him, well, I'm glad you told us this because we're not exactly happy with how you're performing. I mean, we promoted you because you were this guy. You had, these qualities, A, B, and C. And because we knew that your approach was X, Y, Z. But now that you're in this role, you're not doing any of that stuff. And he said, oh, well, but that's because I thought I had to be like the chairman. And his style is so different. Boy, talk about a misunderstanding, right? And so the point is, what Howard took from that lesson was, you must be authentic and true to yourself, and you have to know your own values, because if you don't, it's easy to try to emulate other people or try to become other people. And guess what? You are who you are. You try to be someone else, and like Howard was, you're going to end up miserable. So, I mean, the story has a great ending in the sense that, guess what? Howard went back to being Howard, the guy that they wanted to promote, and he didn't emulate the chairman. And that was just fine because Howard had his own set of values, his own way of doing things, and that's what they loved about him. He didn't need to go changing himself in the first place. So there's really two lessons of that. One is, yes, know thyself, so that you can lead others. Because if you don't know yourself, it's going to be really hard for you to lead people consistently. But the second part of it is, you can't be anybody except yourself. So get to know yourself well, accept who you are, and just be authentic about that, because that's what people respect. That's what people love about you. That's why you're a leader already. It's because of who you are, not because you're able to emulate someone else. All right, so that was his first big principle, and he called it wear one hat. And what it really means is know yourself, know your values, and stick to them. Do not sway, do not try to emulate others, just be yourself. Now, the second one, and I particularly love this one, is his idea and his principle that people come first. And it's interesting, he named his book, It's Not About the Coffee. And of course, when he took that to Howard Schultz, who's the founder of Starbucks, he was like, gee, I don't know. It's a book about Starbucks. Why are you saying it's not about the coffee? But this is where that other principle came in. Yes, they were a company making coffee and selling coffee and serving coffee. But really, what he and also Howard Schultz believed was, this is an organization about people. This is a business about people. Our coffee serves people. Our coffee is part of people's culture and what they do every day. It makes them happy. So they were looking at it as a people business, both in terms of their organization and their customers, and not a coffee business. And boy, is that powerful, right? Because all of our businesses are really about the people, but it's really easy to get caught up and think that they're about the thing, the product, the service, whatever it is. Yes, it is, but it's really about the people first, because without a solid team, without people in your organization, what do you have? You really have nothing, right? And so he gives this example of just how committed Howard Schultz and Starbucks were to this idea of really caring about people first. He describes it as, Starbucks was going through a really tough financial period, and it would have been very, very easy to cut back health benefits. It would have saved them millions of dollars. And yet, Not a single person on the board made that suggestion. Why? Because they knew that that was not even a remote possibility, because Howard Schultz is very clear about sort of his leadership philosophy. And part of it was this. He grew up, his father was a sole breadwinner. His father had a manual labor job. He got hurt on the job, didn't get any workers' comp, didn't have any health insurance, couldn't get the care he needed, couldn't work, and their family struggled. And Howard Schultz vowed to himself that if he were ever in a position where he was, employing other people, that they would always be cared for, that they would always have health benefits. So even when Starbucks was in this tight spot and so many companies would make that decision, ooh, here's a juicy place we can cut costs, it wasn't even on his radar. And what's testament to him in terms of his personal philosophy is that everybody knew this. No one even tried to suggest it to him because they knew that he had staked his position on this. It was his personal philosophy. The people come first. And so that's what I'm really talking about here, right? That's one example, Howard Behar. That was his personal philosophy. And he has a few other concepts in the book. It's a good book if you want to dive in. But those are the two that certainly resonated with me and that I thought would be really helpful to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here. So he's a well-known guy, obviously very successful. But let me also share with you the personal leadership philosophy from my friend who I dedicated this episode to. His name is Dave. And we were talking one day. In fact, it's interesting. We know each other from Starbucks. So a nice little segue there. And we were talking about leadership and positive leadership. And boy, is he an exemplary when it comes to being a positive leader. I mean, the guy is just always glass half full, no matter what. And what he told me was three things. He led teams his whole career, and he had three key aspects, concepts, if you like, that guided him throughout his very successful career. Number one, he saw his role as a leader to be a cheerleader, to be encouraging his team, to be encouraging their success, setting them up for success, and reinforcing that when it happens, celebrating it with them, helping them, move forward in their careers. And related to that, number two in his personal philosophy was he saw his role as knocking down obstacles. So here he was cheerleading them along. But if an obstacle presented itself that were holding his team back or holding back someone from getting ahead the way they should, he would put himself in a position to help knock down that obstacle for them. So essentially, he saw himself not as some, leader that needed to be looked up to and idealized, and it was about him and he's taking credit for his team. Not at all. He was very much a servant leader in the sense that he saw himself simply as a facilitator to help his team move forward, to personally develop them, to professionally develop them. And of course, in the process of all that, he had a really cohesive, happy team that were super productive, right? And his third element that he had, because I said to him, well, that all sounds really rosy, Dave, I like that. But what did you do? There had to have been conflicts on your team. There's always conflicts on a team, whether they're interpersonal, they're interprofessional, whatever. There's always got to be conflicts on a team from time to time. How did you manage those? I mean, you couldn't just cheerlead one person along if they're in conflict with another and, knocking down obstacles when it's actually happening within your team. That's challenging. He said, Alex, I would sit them down together. We would sit down together and I would say, how do we resolve this? So again, even though he was the leader, he didn't see himself as being the person who had to figure it all out and find the solution and then tell his team, this is the solution. He involved them. He got their buy-in. He wanted to hear what the issue was. He said, how do we resolve this? And he said, we worked as a team always on problems, whether they were of a project nature, a personal nature, whatever they were. How do we resolve this? So that's his personal philosophy. And I'm sure after he listens to this, he's going to tell me he's got more points than that. But those were the three that I took away from our really meaningful conversation. So his three were: be a cheerleader, knock down obstacles. How do we resolve this? We do everything as a team. All right. And then I'll just share with you really quickly mine. So I have, it's interesting. I came up with 5 words, and this is an interesting way to do it, right? If you want to sort of have this compass for yourself, and especially if it's new to you, you might want to pick 5 words and, put them on a Post-it note, put them on your computer monitor or wherever you work that you can see them regularly. So my 5 words that comprise my personal leadership philosophy are values, mentor, adapt, learning, and development. So values, right, as recommended by Howard Behar that we were talking about earlier, I recognize, like he said, the need to know myself, my values, and what matters to me. And this means that for me, family will always come first, and that I am committed to continual learning, consistently producing high quality work, and positively supporting those around me, whether they are employees, peers, or clients. And as such, these are the values that I bring to my organization and that I want my team members to share and value too. For mentor, my personal leadership philosophy has always been one of mentoring and nurturing people, because I modeled what I had experienced from leaders early in my career. I was fortunate to have bosses who saw some raw talent in me, and bless them for doing it, because when I look back on that time when I was just starting out in my career, boy, did I make some blunders. There is no doubt about it. But they saw something in me, and they took it upon themselves to help me to develop whatever they saw and refine it so that I had valuable skills. And that paved the way for a lot of my professional success. And I've always been grateful for these mentors, some of whom are still close friends and advisors 20 plus years later. So from that perspective, I want the people who work for me to feel seen and valued just as I was when I was young and trying to figure out my path. Now, when it comes to my third word, adapt, this one I see as crucial for the times in which we operate. The only thing that's certain is that stuff is going to change, right? I mean, we all know that. I mean, just look at how technology has changed the workplace, our personal lives, how we interact with one another over the last decade. I mean, as we enter this decade now in 2020, we've got artificial intelligence becoming more prevalent in the workplace. We have multiple generations working together. There are numerous ways that the challenges we face are always changing. And so we as leaders must be able to adapt. This is, after all, the reason you're alive and able to listen to this podcast, because your ancestors adapted and survived. So this one is a crucial element of my leadership philosophy. And then finally, learning and development, which, arguably you could say are kind of the same thing, but to me, they're slightly different. And I did touch on these a little earlier, but these are just core aspects of who I am. I always want to be learning and growing. And I want the same for my team, because after all, if we're not learning and growing, what are we? We're stagnant, or worse yet, we are regressing. All right, so those are my 5 words, my leadership philosophy. What are yours? And have you thought about this? I mean, some of you probably already have a philosophy, but you might not have written it down or really clarified it. Some of you might not have thought much about this at all. Either way, take some time to sit down and ponder on this and ask yourself these 3 questions and write down the answers. They're simple questions, but they will make you think a little deeper. So number 1, what matters most to you? What are your values, right? What is at the core of your life? Like, you cannot operate without these core values and what matters most to you in place. Number 2, how do you want to be perceived or remembered as a leader, right? Just think about that. Like, how do you want people to talk about you as a leader? And are you being that person right now is sort of the part B of that question. And question 3, what do you want most for your team and the people you work with? Right? So the first 2 are about you, right? You've got to know thyself first, as Howard would say from Starbucks. What matters most to you? What are your values? Number 2, how do you want to be perceived or remembered as a leader, right? So the first one is very inward. The second one is outward. And the third one is obviously going more outward again. It's about other people because it is about people, and we know that. So think about that, write those down, look over those answers and see what emerges as the common themes. You know, what's coming through as your personal leadership philosophy? Are there specific words or phrases you can use to sort of sum up this philosophy? And like I said earlier, maybe pin those up, just like I have my 5 words, pin them up where you do most of your work so they're there as a guiding reminder for how you want to lead and make decisions. All right. That is what it's all about, to have a personal leadership philosophy. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's Positive Leadership Movement episode, as we really kind of dug into other people's philosophies. I shared mine. Hopefully I've got you to start thinking about your own. And so go now and really crystallize what that is so that you know it inside and out, and you will not be swayed. It will be the lens through which you make all your decisions and deal with all your challenges and your changes and when tough times come up. All right. So that's it for this week, but join me next week when we're going to talk about a way that you can unlock resources already within your organization. And that is by cultivating positive identities. We all have stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And so if we're going to be positive leaders and create a positive work culture, we need to make sure that happens on the inside so that we can have a real impact on the outside. So tune in next week for that. And remember, if you've got a question or comment about positive leadership, send me an email at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com and I'll answer them in a future episode. For now, this is Alex Bratty signing off and thanking you for being part of the positive leadership movement and inspiring me to do what I do every single day.
Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you like this episode, please rate and review. If you want to get more from Alex, check out Happiness at Work, where she provides leaders with a proven path to cultivate a positive work culture that increases performance, productivity, and profitability. Go to happinessatworknow.com. Join us next week and harness the power of positive leadership for your organization.